I believe a lot of people think of emotions as sort of leftovers from our animalistic state, that we have no control over them or very limited control over them. But if you ever tried to not cry at a sad movie or forced to smile when you're annoyed, clearly there's some social rules that go around emotions. But I'm also going to try to convince you in this lecture that emotions are an essential aspect of society. We couldn't have society, not just ourselves, we couldn't have society without emotions. First, let's look at the role of society in emotions by dissecting what an emotion is. There's certainly different types of emotions, but I want to look at everything that goes around it. First, I want to say there is that physiological arousal we get. It might be an excitement, it might be anger or something like that. But there's also other things that surround that feeling that may be animalistic, maybe not. First is what conjures that emotion, the situational cues that tell the emotion to go ahead and do it. So picture a scenario where you're walking down the street and somebody bumps you. In one condition, they don't say anything. In another condition, they say, "Excuse me." Which one do you think is likely to arouse the emotion of anger, right? So there are also expressive gestures and labels. That is, what you're expected to do when you're angry or happy or sad. And then the labels themselves, not only what we call it, such as joy or anger or whatever, but also how you feel that is. Is it a good emotion, a bad emotion, and so forth? And so society is involved with what triggers that feeling, but also what we call the feeling and how we actually conjure that feeling in the real world. In psychology, we distinguish between primary emotions and secondary emotions. And it's generally believed there's some emotions that are universal around the planet among all humans. And in fact, we can apply them to other mammals as well. They might include things like joy, fear, anger, sadness, or surprise. Secondary emotions stem from primary emotions and generally are associated with higher order processing, such as hope, anxiety, resentment, shame, or shock. And you can see how they might stem from primary emotions such as joy and hope, fear, anxiety, anger, resentment, and so forth. That becomes important, at least for part of sociology, when we look at how we apply those emotions to ourselves and other people. Emotional discrimination refers to moments in which we apply primary emotions to our outgroups and secondary emotions to our in-groups, hence sort of demonizing or almost making them less than human. So an example of this might be the end of a game in which one team won and obviously the other team lost. A sports fan might describe their team's victory as a moment of exhilarating pride, a secondary emotion, but dismiss the opposing team's sadness as merely bad sportsmanship rather than genuine disappointment or grief over a loss. This reflects attributing more complex humanized emotions to their in-groups. Now this is where the rubber meets the road, because symbolic interactionists view the role of emotions in our interactions as a source of fuel to start those interactions in the first place, to keep those interactions going, and when the emotion dissipates in some cases, to end interactions. I really want to stress Randall Collins' theory of interaction ritual chains because he's the first sociologist to really come along with a very specific theory about the role of emotions in developing and maintaining society in the first place. He says the engine for society is emotional energy. And emotional energies come when people come together physically. It naturally produces a kind of feeling that people like. We're almost like addicted to it. And we know from research that just being around other people does stimulate the brain in some way. So that part is definitely true. This theory is important because social life is not just about a logical set of exchanges that we get in exchange theory, that there's a profoundly emotional drive that keeps us in interaction, explains why we even bother to get in the interaction, but it's also something that's being exchanged at the same time. And as a result, society continues, despite the fact that sometimes it might be irrational to do the things we do in groups. There's something else going on there other than just what's being exchanged among people. On the base level, let's think about an example of a concert or a sporting event. The shared excitement and sense of unity among the crowd, emotional energy, are not just a byproduct of the event. They are central to the experience, binding people together and creating a collective effervescence. This shared emotion can then influence individual behaviors like cheering louder or even forming new social connections. The same thing could be applied to much more mundane behavior. It's just a little harder to see how this plays out in an office environment or at school or at church or other places where you may not have that goal of emotional connection in the first place. But it's still there, and it's still important to the development and maintenance of society. This section underscores the idea that our emotional lives are not simply innate, but are deeply cultivated through social processes. We are taught not only to recognize emotions, but also how to manage and express them in socially acceptable ways. The concept of emotional scripts is particularly powerful, revealing the subtle, often unspoken rules that govern our emotional performances in a variety of settings. This continuous learning and adaptation are essential for smooth social interaction and for maintaining our desired self-presentations. Let's use the example of a job interview. You might feel nervous, physiological change, but your emotional script dictates that you should display confidence and enthusiasm. Expressive gestures, perhaps by maintaining eye contact and a firm handshake. The emotional cues, the formal setting, professional attire, tell you this is the appropriate display. And all of this comes together. It's orchestrated without a whole lot of thought. Here, I want to really stress the idea that just like much of what we talked about this entire semester, there are some people who have more control over meaning making than others, and that includes emotional expression. Kemper talks about the power status approach, arguing that power and status are the most significant structural influences on our emotion. And think about a scenario in which you have a boss and an employee who is able to express their anger or other emotions, negative emotions, more than the other. And typically it's going to be the boss. Who sets the tone for the office? Again, it typically is the boss. So our status in society is not just about what we get in this world. It also influences day-to-day interaction, and it influences meaning-making and interaction, as well as emotional meaning-making and expression on a day-to-day basis. Let's stop for a moment. I want you to think for a second, what kind of job do you think you're going to have when you graduate college? As many as 50% of you probably aren't sure about that. But I suspect that even among that 50%, a lot of you are going to do service jobs. In the last 50 years in America, we've moved away from manufacturing and more service labor. Service labor can range from cleaning toilets to being a medical doctor. And they each have different levels of income, prestige, and so forth. But one thing they have all in common is you're working with and for other people. Why is that important? Because according to Hochschild, we engage in emotion work whenever we have to deal with other people. We just can't have an emotion and go with it. We have to bite our tongue even when we want to snap at somebody. We have to be kind to a customer even if that customer is not being nice to us. And this has changed the nature of work and really has strained our emotional lives in a very difficult way. You might have heard of Goleman's emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the idea that some of us are able to manage our emotional lives better than others, manage our relationships with other people at work and at home better than others. And it's no surprise that this concept came up in the last 20 or 30 years in America because it's the last 20 or 30 years in which we shifted from doing labor in a factory to doing labor with other people. Hence, we need the ability to interact with other people, and that skill. It's become important, but that's because the economy changed. So it's another way society is impacting our emotional lives above and beyond anything that might be part of our biology. Finally, I want to stress that research from Clark and other people show that there's this socio-emotional economy in which, while we're not exchanging like money and things like that, There are emotional exchanges that go on all the time, and there's expectations for people to react in certain ways, and when they don't, our brain keeps track of all that stuff. And it makes it even more pressing because if you interact with more and more people, and people in sales and service are doing this all the time, it's hard to manage all those relationships and all the feelings that are being exchanged all the time. But we know that this happens all the time in the modern workforce, which is very demanding in an emotional sense, even if it's not physically demanding. Finally, I want to emphasize how entire societies and communities can influence our emotional lives. This concept of emotion culture dictates that expectations about how to experience different emotions and display those emotions can be generated on the macro level society. This is what Lynn Laughlin would argue is emotion culture. And emotion culture helps us to decide how we're going to experience different, or how we should experience different emotions, in addition to how we display those emotions in any given culture. And there's a lot of factors that she demonstrates about how different societies might expect you to experience grief, for instance, in different environments. So a culture or society with high death rates might experience the grief over the death of a loved one very differently than one with very low mortality rates. Tonys and other sociologists have really divided the world into two types of communities. One is Gemeinschaft. There's different names for it with different scholars and researchers. And Gemeinschaft societies are those that have strong family and kinship ties, high cohesion, shared identity. We typically associate them with rural areas. Gesellschaft is what we tend to associate with modern societies and living in large populations. And those societies are based primarily on self-interest. And we have to work out our individuality to get the things we need in this world. The reason that's important for our study of emotions is that you can see in these two different types of communities, people are going to experience their emotional lives very differently. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is simply that the structural conditions that we've been born into are going to have a huge influence on how we think of emotion internally and express that emotion externally, depending on where we grow up. And it had nothing to do with our emotional intelligence. The group processes perspectives help us understand emotion in a very different way. Once again, they focus on exchange theory, exchanges between individuals, and try to understand emotions in that environment. The affect theory of social exchange suggests that exchange relationships produce emotions that serve as internal rewards or punishments, fostering cohesion with individuals or the group as a whole. The negative emotions in these interactions can serve as a reason to break up the group. A sort of sub-theory under this is the equity theory of emotions, and it's based on the idea that individuals feel negative emotions when exchanges are perceived unfair for any reason. This can be rectified in one of two ways. One is you can have distributive justice, that is, you do things so that everybody gets an equal outcome. But another one that a lot of people forget is procedural justice, creating the belief that even an unfair outcome is justified in some way. Perhaps one person didn't follow the rules, so they don't deserve as much as the other people, in which case everyone feels a sense that everything is okay, it's fair, and the emotions are maintained in a positive way, hence maintaining the group. So imagine a situation where you're in a study group. If everyone contributes equally and supports each other, members are likely to feel positive emotions like camaraderie and satisfaction, reinforcing the group's cohesion. Conversely, if one person constantly dominates or slacks off, negative emotions might arise. In either case, it's those exchanges and the sense of fairness in exchanges that create emotion which can help the group or hurt the group. In some respects, I think emotion should be relegated to psychology. I mean, after all, sociologists look at social relationships and whole societies. But I hope you've seen in this lecture that what is going on in the macro level society filters its way to the most personal and intimate parts of your life.